Imagine waking up one morning and the power is out. Not just your block, not just your city, everywhere. The grid is gone, and for the first time in your life, you sit in the silence of a world that has forgotten how to exist without energy it has to pay for. You look at your phone, dead. You look at your walls, cold. You look outside, and the sky is the same sky it has always been. The sun is rising. The wind is moving. The earth beneath your feet is humming with something ancient, something immense, something that has always been there. And then the question comes, quietly, almost like a whisper. What if the power was never supposed to cost anything at all? What if someone, a long time ago, already figured that out? And what if that answer was taken? This is not a story about conspiracy. This is a story about history, about patents that vanished, about scientists who disappeared, about laboratories that burned, about technologies that worked, that were documented, that were witnessed, and then, one by one, were quietly erased from the record. You will not find these in your textbooks. You will not find them in the curricula of the most prestigious universities on earth. But they existed, and some of them still exist, buried, waiting, beneath decades of silence. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear will not just change how you think about energy. It will change how you think about knowledge itself. Let us begin in the late 1800s, a time when the world was on the edge of something magnificent. The industrial age was roaring, cities were growing, and one man, standing in a laboratory in Colorado Springs, believed he had found something that would make the concept of an energy bill as absurd as charging people for the air they breathe. His name was Nikola Tesla, and you already know that name. But here is what makes this strange. You know the name, yet you do not know the full story, because the full story was not meant to survive. Tesla was not simply an inventor. He was something closer to a translator. He believed the Earth itself was a conductor, that the atmosphere above us was charged with electrical potential so vast, so continuous, that if you understood the resonant frequency of the planet, you could tap into it, anywhere, for free, permanently. He called his grand experiment Wardenclyffe Tower, a structure he built on Long Island at the turn of the 20th century. It was not a power plant in the way we understand power plants. It was something closer to an antenna for the Earth's own energy. Tesla believed he could transmit electrical power wirelessly across the entire globe, not just to cities, but to ships at sea, to rural villages with no infrastructure, to anywhere a human being happened to stand. The tower was funded initially by J.P. Morgan, one of the most powerful financiers in American history. But that funding was pulled. The tower was left incomplete. And then, in 1917, it was demolished. Officially, the explanation given was that the site had become a financial liability. That is where the story shifts, because buried in the letters Tesla wrote during that period is a sentence that stops you cold. Morgan asked him, once the system was running, where would you put the meter? And Tesla had no answer. Because there was no meter. Because you cannot charge someone for something that belongs to everyone. And that, it seems, was precisely the problem. The tower came down. Tesla died in 1943, alone, in a New York hotel room. And within hours of his death, agents from the Office of Alien Property entered that room and seized every document, every notebook, every scrap of paper he had ever written on. Officially, it was a wartime precaution. But here is the layer that does not fit neatly into that explanation. Many of those documents have never been fully released to the public. The question is not whether that happened. The question is why a physicist's notebooks about energy transmission required the same level of security as a weapons program. Now, Tesla is the name everyone knows. But let us move deeper. Let us talk about the names you have never heard. In the 1930s, a man named Thomas Henry Moray presented a device to engineers and scientists across the United States. He called it the radiant energy device. It was roughly the size of a briefcase. It had no fuel source, no battery, no connection to the power grid. And yet, when witnesses observed it, It produced over 50 kilowatts of power, continuously. Moray demonstrated it dozens of times in front of credentialed scientists, engineers, and government officials. Officially, the scientific establishment concluded that Moray's device was a hoax, though none of them could explain how the hoax worked. But here is what makes this strange. Moray was shot at, twice, in separate incidents. His laboratory was broken into and the device was destroyed. His research was confiscated. And then he was systematically discredited. Not because his demonstrations failed, but because no one within the existing framework could explain what was powering it. In science, when you cannot explain something, you are supposed to investigate. You are not supposed to suppress. Moray believed he was drawing energy from cosmic radiation, from the same background energy that permeates all of space. Modern physics calls this the zero-point field. It is not fringe science. It is documented, accepted quantum mechanics. The Casimir effect demonstrates it. The concept that even in a perfect vacuum, at absolute zero temperature, energy still exists, is not a hypothesis. It is measured. It is real. The question that has never been satisfactorily answered is whether that energy can be harvested at scale. And the reason that question remains open is, at least in part, because the people closest to answering it kept finding their work destroyed. In 1950 Switzerland, a naval engineer named Paul Baumann developed a device he called the Testatica. It was built inside a small religious community located in the Swiss Alps. The device produced electricity from atmospheric static charge. It had no moving parts that could explain its output. Scientists and energy researchers traveled from around the world to witness it. Swiss federal energy authorities examined it. Reports describe a device that produced kilowatts of power from what appeared to be nothing more than the static charge in surrounding air. The technology was never independently replicated. No full external examination was ever permitted. And so the device exists in a kind of limbo. Witnessed, but not proven. Documented, but not distributed. Officially, mainstream science calls it unverified. What it has never been called is impossible. That distinction matters more than it might seem. There is a principle in the history of science that rarely gets discussed openly. The principle of suppression by funding. You do not need to destroy a laboratory with dramatic force. You simply do not fund the research. You do not publish the papers. You do not grant the patents. And over time, the questions stop being asked, not because they were answered, because the machinery that produces answers was systematically starved. This is documented in the philosophy of science, in the work of Thomas Kuhn, who described the extraordinary resistance new frameworks always meet, not because they are wrong, but because they threaten the coherence of everything that came before. In the 1980s, a man named Stanley Meyer claimed to have invented a device that could run an internal combustion engine on water. Not on hydrogen extracted through conventional electrolysis, which requires more energy than it produces. On water, directly, using what he described as resonant electrolytic dissociation. He demonstrated it. He held patents filed with the United States Patent Office, which reviewed and granted them. In 1996, Meyer was awarded the Inventor of the Year award by the state of Ohio. In 1998, he died suddenly at a restaurant, after an unexplained illness that began within minutes of a meeting with individuals his brother described as NATO representatives. His brother stated publicly that Stan had run from the restaurant saying he had been poisoned. The official cause of death was listed as a brain aneurysm. His technology was never independently replicated. His laboratory was dismantled. The patents sit in a public database today, unexplained, unverified, and almost entirely ignored by the institutions that could resolve them. Pause here. Not to tell you what to believe, but to ask you something quiet and serious. How many times does a pattern need to repeat before it stops being coincidence? Victor Schauberger was an Austrian naturalist who spent decades studying the movement of water in nature. He observed that water in natural streams follows a precise spiral motion, a vortex, and that this motion produces a measurable energetic effect. He built devices he called implosion machines to harness this energy. During World War II, he was forced by the Nazi regime to work on their technology programs. After the war, American agents took custody of his research. He traveled to the United States in 1958, where he met with government and military officials for several months. He signed documents in English, a language he did not speak or read. He returned to Austria, telling his son that they had taken everything from him. He died 5 days later. His documents were never returned to his family. Each name in this documentary is separated by decades, by geography, by discipline. They worked in different fields, pursued different mechanisms, spoke different languages, and yet the outline around them is identical. Discovery, documentation, demonstration, suppression. We are now past the midpoint of this journey, and I want to stop here. Because this is not really a story about machines. It is a story about knowledge, about who controls it, about what happens when a discovery threatens not just an industry, but an entire architecture of power, economic, political, and social, built on the assumption of scarcity. The entire financial architecture of the modern world rests on the idea that energy is limited, that it must be extracted, refined, transported, and paid for at every step. A world of free, abundant, distributed energy is not just a technological revolution. It is a revolution in who gets to decide the terms of civilization itself. And historically, the people who decide those terms have never surrendered them voluntarily. John Hutchison, a Canadian inventor, documented in the 1980s a series of anomalous effects in his Vancouver laboratory. Metal objects levitated. Different metals fused together at room temperature without heat or adhesive. He filmed these events and invited researchers to observe them. Both the Canadian and American military investigated his laboratory on separate occasions. The official position is that his results were never independently reproduced. What is less often mentioned is that his laboratory was raided twice by Canadian authorities and his equipment confiscated both times. If the results were simply impossible, the rational response is to ignore them. You do not confiscate the equipment of a hoax. You do not send military investigators to a magician's apartment. Dr. Shinichi Seike, a Japanese scientist, published in the 1960s and 70s a series of papers on electromagnetic interactions with gravitational fields that he argued could produce usable energy. His papers appeared in peer-reviewed journals. Observers reported anomalous outputs from devices built in his laboratory at the Gravity Research Institute. He died in 1989. His laboratory was dismantled. His papers exist in scattered archives. No major research institution has pursued his theoretical framework. Not because it was proven wrong, because it was never adequately tested. And then there is the 10th, not a name, a number. Room 1107 of the United States Patent Office. That is where, according to declassified documents obtained through Freedom of Information requests, certain patent applications are flagged under what is called a secrecy order. Under U.S. law, patents deemed to threaten national security can be classified. They are filed, examined, and sealed. The inventor is legally prohibited from discussing the technology, demonstrating it, or attempting to commercialize it. As of the most recent available figures, over 5,000 patents are currently under active secrecy orders in the United States alone. Among the documented cases are multiple applications related to over-unity energy devices, zero-point energy systems, and advanced electromagnetic propulsion. These patents exist. The inventors exist. The applications exist. They are simply not allowed to see the light. Now we arrive at the question that has been building beneath every word of this documentary. Not who suppressed these technologies, but why they remain suppressed today. Because we are not in the 1890s anymore. The infrastructure of the energy industry has already been built. The pipelines, the refineries, the power plants, the grids. So why, in a world facing a genuine climate crisis, in a world where entire nations lack reliable electricity, in a world where the cost of energy drives poverty and conflict, does this research remain buried? The answer is not simple. Part of it is institutional inertia. Science does not easily revisit what it has dismissed. Part of it is genuine uncertainty. Some of these technologies may not work as described. The history of science is also the history of well-meaning inventors who were simply wrong. But the totality of the pattern, the consistency of the suppression, the documented confiscations, the sealed patents, that totality is harder to attribute entirely to coincidence or institutional momentum. Something has been happening. Something systematic. Something that has, for over a century, ensured that the question of free energy remains permanently in the category of unresolved, rather than tested and answered. And here is what I want to leave you with. Not certainty, but a different quality of curiosity. Because the most powerful thing a human being can do, more powerful than any technology, is to ask the question they have been told is not worth asking. Every revolution in human understanding began with someone who refused to accept the official explanation, who looked at the anomaly and did not look away, who understood that the boundaries of knowledge are not walls, they are doors, and that someone, always, has a reason for keeping them locked. These 10 technologies, and the men behind them, did not fail because they were wrong. They were stopped before anyone could know if they were right. That is the distinction that should stay with every one of us. Not the drama of suppression, but the quiet, uncomfortable weight of questions that were never allowed to be answered. We are living in a moment where those questions are more urgent than they have ever been, where the cost of energy is not an abstraction, but a daily burden on billions of lives. And somewhere, in sealed archives, in scattered papers, in the half-destroyed notes of brilliant minds who were stopped before they could finish, there may be answers we were never allowed to see. This is the vault of secrets, and this vault is only beginning to open. If what you heard today made something shift in you, if it made you lean forward instead of back, if it lit something that does not want to return to the surface, then you are exactly who this channel was built for. We do not deal in noise here, we deal in depth. In the questions that institutions do not want asked, in the history that did not make it into the textbooks, in the patterns that only become visible when you are willing to step back far enough to see them. Every episode goes deeper. Every vault holds something heavier than the last. Subscribe now, not because a number matters, but because you are choosing, in this moment, to be part of a community of people who refuse to stop asking, who understand that the most dangerous thing in the world is not a forbidden technology. It is a mind that has learned to stop being curious. Share this with one person who is ready to ask a harder question. Leave a comment below with the name or technology that unsettled you most, because your thoughts belong in this conversation. And if you want to go even deeper, the next episode is already waiting. The pattern continues, and the further you go, the clearer it becomes. The truth was never destroyed. It was only hidden. And hidden things, always, have a way of being found.